Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. It's poll release day here at the Texas Politics Project. Today we made public the results of a poll of registered voters that we fielded from August 29th to September 6th, sample of 1,200 self-declared registered voters. Very happy to be joined by my friends and collaborators on the polling project. Daron Shaw, professor of government at UT Austin. Welcome back, Daron.
Good morning. Good to see you, Professor Henson.
We missed you last time.
No, you got
I
some
believe
hack.
You were
you got
traveling.
That hack Ross Ramsey.
You got Ross Ramsey.
Man,
we pulled him out of retirement.
That's tough.
I got an email from Ross this morning commenting on the poll, and he didn't say it. I did tell him we missed him. And also Josh Blank, research director of the Texas Politics Project. Thanks for the ride to work today, Josh. Wow. Among all the other tons and tons of work you have done.
We were definitely carpooling.
We were definitely carpooling. You know, Daron, I think I kind of mentioned this in passing in response to some of the trolling we've gotten on the poll, which is inevitable. But I was wondering, I don't think you and I have talked about it. You realize this is the 51st poll since we started this series of polls?
God, I know. I can't believe it. Congratulations to you, not so much to me.
Well, I would say congratulations to both of us. But I was thinking, this isn't the first thing I think I talked you into since we began working together at UT. But it may be one of the more successful things.
One of the more consequential. I think that's probably right. Yeah. Well, it's nice. It's nice to have a time series. It's nice to have some history and mileage, so that when you look at what we're looking at here, you can draw on a reservoir of past results and compare 2022 to 2018, 2014, 2010, for goodness sakes. Wow, we do go back, don't we?
And we've done, I think, one thing that we definitely have followed through on is one of the ideas we had was to make something that was, at the time, I think, pretty uniquely transparent and public.
Yeah. No, that's been, if you go to the site.
At least in Texas.
Yeah. If you go to the website, I find it increasingly, as a lot of pollsters use a mix of probability and non-probability sampling, use a mix of what we call modes, some telephone, some online. It's, I would encourage our listeners to go to any of the, statewide polling that's done by reputable institutions and universities and try to figure out exactly what they're doing. And part of it is that it's complicated, and part of it is that I don't think they trust their audiences to understand what's going on. And we've tried to really, open the curtain and let our audience know what's going on.
And for better and for worse.
That's
but
right.
Mostly
That's
for the
right.
better.
Yeah.
Josh, you can't see Josh's face. Like, well, I guess
That's good. No, I like it.
Well, so I thought that today, while in our time together, I can't get the Carol. I put this line in these notes, and I can't get the Carol Burnett song out of my. Now Josh is like, "What are you talking about?"
Yeah, now we are dating
and Daron
ourselves.
gets the joke.
Yeah.
At some point, I'll tell you the story. I played golf with Harvey Korman once, but that's for another day.
I'd like to hear that. I would like to hear that.
It's on the other podcast.
Yeah, exactly. The fun one.
So I thought we'd bow to the inevitable today and spend most of our time just talking about the results related to the upcoming election, and what we think the results overall tell us about the election environment as we get, right, not next to the election. We're not right there on it, but we're getting pretty close. And the poll was very much designed, not just to look at the trial ballots or the horse races, but to try to capture and get some leverage on what the election environment is like in Texas right now. So, Josh, why don't you start us off, if you could, by giving us an overview of what we got in the trial ballots that we did do to kind of set the stage.
Sure. So, the main trial ballots we asked about were for governor, lieutenant governor, and attorney general. The results that we're reporting are among registered voters, and we can talk about that in a little bit. Overall, in this poll, we saw Abbott leading O'Rourke 45-40 among registered voters, so a 5-point lead. This is pretty similar, though slightly narrower than his June lead of 45-39. We could just say it's the same if we want to, right? But it certainly is a decline from where he was back in April and in February when his lead was closer to 10 points among this population. So, I would say there's stuff in the results that we can talk about that both sides can be happy with, but maybe one more than the other. And then we look at the lieutenant governor's race. We see that Dan Patrick has a 7-point lead over Mike Collier in a rematch of their last 2018 election. So he's at 39%, Collier's at 32%. Here we see a significantly higher share of people not having an opinion yet. So 1 in 5 voters, 20%, say that they just haven't formed an opinion yet on this race. That's only down 5 points from June, but that's kind of what you'd expect at this point.
Yeah.
And then in the Attorney General's contest, it's a little bit tighter. We see Ken Paxton leading Rochelle Garza 38% to 33%. That's a little bit of a narrowing from an 8-point lead back in June when he was 37-29. Again, about 1 in 5 voters have not formed an opinion yet about this race, which is not surprising because obviously at the top of the ticket with O'Rourke and with Abbott, we have 2 universally known candidates, and then as we move along, even, the lieutenant governor is not universally known, nor is the attorney general, and certainly their challengers are far, far from universally known.
Right. And we saw some of that when we did the approval,
we did fave unfaves,
the fave unfaves on all the candidates, which people can see. And I should mention, if you want to follow along at home, all these results are public at our website at the Texas Politics Project, which is texaspolitics.utexas.edu. You'll see a tag for polling. Just, follow your nose. So, Daron, we talked a lot of we'll start at the top, and obviously the marquee race. And we've had a little bit of discussion about this as we were looking at the data. Like, what do you make of this race right now?
Yeah, I mean, Josh pointed out that it's maybe a tick better for O'Rourke than it was in the spring. But I look back, I think the first ballot we ran was in February 22.
Yeah, that's right.
So let's just read Abbott's numbers: 47, 48, 45, 45. And let's look at O'Rourke: 37, 37, 39, 40. There's not a lot going on there, frankly. And it's not unexpected that over the course of a summer, when people are doing other things, maybe not traveling as much as they'd like to because of gas prices, but that the race is sort of steady state. If you told me this race was 4 points, I wouldn't be surprised. If you told me this race was 10 points, I wouldn't be surprised. I think we're kind of right in there, and there's going to be a lot made out of, well, wait, it's 5, not 8. What's the matter with your and look, we're showing that, that Abbott has a lead, just outside the margin of error. He's running for, a third term. I mean, he's well known. There's kind of a sense in presidential elections that when a party's trying to win, the White House for the third time, that there's Alan Abramowitz at Emory University calls it his time for a change variable, which is he just plugs in a negative coefficient basically to drop the expected vote share of the in party. So maybe we're seeing a little bit of that here, but maybe we're just seeing some polling noise. We've had a conversation about what we think the default party ID spread is, or vote spread is in a Texas election. Mm-hmm. And over the course of this poll, Jim and I were doing in the early 2000s, I guess we'd probably say it was like 12 to 15 points. Yeah. And now I think it's like, 5 to 10. And you get particularly good or bad candidates. Yeah. You can fall outside it, but I think these are 2 pretty good candidates. So I'd expect something in that range.
Yeah, or you have as we like to say, exogenous shocks or extraneous circumstances like in 2018 when you've got sort of Trump as this overwhelming force, and again that force is still impacting because you have a Republican in the White House. You expect there to be a tough midterm election, but that made let's say in that race, you saw O'Rourke come to 2.5. So he kind of moved outside of that 5 to 10 range you would expect and pushed up.
Well,
so
it's a line I overuse, but I mean, it's easy to forget, particularly when we do so much state level polling. And Daron, you do so much more national polling, but it's easy to forget Texas still is part of the United States.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's, the context here is interesting, right? That the Republicans are playing defense in the state of Texas in a way they are not nationally, right? Nationally, the Democrats have the House, the Democrats have the Senate, the Democrats have the White House. Anything negative that occurs in the country kind of accrues to the detriment of the Democrats. In Texas, it's just more complicated. There's, these problems with the economy and problems with immigration, border security, but it's not clear about the source attribution there. And And I think you see a little bit of that ambivalence in the poll.
Let me ask you about that. Let's talk about this while we're going. I mean, in probably all combinations of the three of us paired off, we've talked at various times about issue ownership. And you were talking about, you mentioned a couple of issues, but part of what seems to have been going on in the summer is that the issue environment got much more complicated for the Abbott campaign. I mean, you just talked about, the stability in the race. Mm-hmm. Do you think that,
right.
Does that come out in the wash that,
yeah.
That it seems like, the Abbott administration had kind of a hard time dealing with Uvalde. I mean, I think you have to be pretty in the tank, I think, to not look at that and think that was not what they wanted. That was not what they wanted to be talking about. And as it has continued to arise in a kind of negative way, that's not great for them. Right?
Yeah, I think a couple observations. The first is the issue environment in the early spring, nationally and in Texas, was so horrible for the Democrats that it was difficult to envision any way in which they'd even be competitive in the state. And I mean by that the sort of residual effects of foreign policy problems in Afghanistan. You had kind of a halting kind of response to COVID, or at least the reemergence and the
new variants,
the declaration of victory a little prematurely on COVID. As justice, higher prices, gas prices, inflation, all of these things, and so you're looking. I was looking at the state of Texas. I'm like, okay, let's see. It's still a Republican state. The issue environment is horrible for the Democrats. I mean, short of a failure of the grid, how are the Democrats going to be competitive? I think that's changed slightly. I mean, you mentioned gun violence and abortion are two issues. Now, I think in Texas, those things are, I wouldn't say they're 50-50 in terms of their effect on the parties. But anything that's not 70-30 in favor of the Republicans is an improvement for the Democrats. Right? Would you rather be talking about border security, or would you rather be talking about gun violence and preventing mass shootings and protecting abortion rights and things like that? So I think in Texas, unlike nationally, where the Democrats have fairly significant advantages on abortion, at least in this context, we're talking about protecting women's right to an abortion. In Texas, that advantage exists, but it's kind of watered down a little bit. But anything's better than talking about gas prices for another couple months.
Right, or the Biden management of the economy.
Exactly, and the border.
I mean, Josh, you've looked a lot. You spent a lot of time looking at these abortion numbers. I mean, there is an interesting dynamic in how the abortion numbers in Texas meet where the policy has wound up post-Dobbs.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, just one quick sort to kind of go back and then come forward for a second. I mean, one of the things I think we were asking in June, about all these dynamics that were at play, both, the role of, say, the economy, inflation, kind of the effect that was happening, even though it was getting a little bit better at that point. But these other things like abortion and gun violence. And one of the things I think that we had talked about, in one of the podcasts between then and now is the fact that, maybe all this is already baked in. We're looking at a pretty steady set of polling results from a lot of, not just us, from different entities that are all kind of showing the race kind of in this space of an Abbott lead of about, 5 to 8 points. The possibility could happen that, you roll out of the summer, inflation's out of the way, the campaign starts spending a bunch of money, and all of a sudden, now we find out what the election's about. But to Daron's point, even on the issues that kind of benefit the Democrats, it's not enough.
Yeah.
And it's not salient enough. And that's sort of the other piece here. So even though, we asked...
And that was really clear in this poll.
Yeah, and we asked a lot of questions. I'll go to where you at and I'll come back here. We asked a lot of questions about abortion. And not to discount it, because there's some really interesting results in there, I think, that, we could dive into maybe on another day. But a lot of it is more of the same. Ultimately, before the laws passed, outline abortion the same, before the Dobbs decision, a majority wasn't in favor of, an outright prohibition across circumstances. That's just never been the case. And it doesn't look like it's going to be the case anytime soon. But the issue here is that I think, for people who think, well, now is this going to change everything? What this data kind of says is probably not. And the reason is because the economy is so salient, immigration and the border are so salient. And so when we looked at, in this poll, basically, we looked at a set of 11 issues that we kind of think that we thought were either, the most sort of salient issues for voters and or that the campaigns were attempting to raise. So we had a nice balance of sort of issues that we think Abbott was trying to talk about, some issues that both candidates were kind of thinking about, and then some issues that I think O'Rourke is trying to talk about. And then we can look at the main groups in the electorate that we think about, and we say, well, what are your most, we said, first of all, who do you trust on each of these issues? How important is each of these issues, and which is the most important? And if we look, at the issues by group, what we find is, among Republicans, among independents, among white voters, Hispanic voters, urban, suburban, and rural voters, they all said that immigration and border security was the most important issue. So this is an issue that Abbott, that again, across the whole electorate, 48% said that Abbott would do a better job on, 36% said O'Rourke. So he has a 12-point advantage in the electorate, and most voters think this is the top issue. The only group of voters who don't think this is Democrats, among whom abortion is the top issue, but 21% shows it as the top issue. So about 1 in 5. Gun control came second. So again, in some ways, there's a sense that gun control and abortion are kind of competing with each other for attention a little bit among Democrats. And then the third issue was climate change and the environment. So ultimately, O'Rourke can,
it's a tough sell in Texas.
Well, not to kind of get to sort of the end of my thing on this, but you kind of come out of these numbers saying, this problem, I don't like to predict things. Because we're forced to predict things even when we don't want to.
Right.
But if you're saying, what do you think's going to happen? I say, I don't know. I don't think O'Rourke has a good looking shot here based on the fact that, he may be closer in the polls than, a traditional Democratic candidate has been. Than a Lupe Valdez, sure. But if you look at the issue environment, you look at the way that voters react on those issues, both to the candidates themselves, to Joe Biden, to Greg Abbott, ultimately, it just seems like a pretty hard sell. Abbott has the ability to talk to Republicans about the two issues that are the most important to them: immigration and border security and the economy. And those are also pretty important issues to most every other group of voters. But if you're O'Rourke, you're trying to talk about abortion over here.
Right.
And guns. And so, there's a mismatch there. And so as strong as O'Rourke looks relative to other Democrats, and he has seen some improvement in some areas that he needs to see.
Well, Democratic enthusiasm was up to the extent that we're thinking about this, this kind of mobilization versus persuasion notion that we were talking about before we started recording. That is good news for O'Rourke's mobilization efforts, but Democratic enthusiasm is still not as high as Republican enthusiasm, and I think for you to even get some leverage on that mobilization effort, assuming that we're getting good sample draws, you got to Democrats have got to surpass Republicans. I think.
Yeah.
Isn't that right? That's an oversimplification, but at some basic level, if you're in a war that's starting from the baseline that you were talking about, Daron, of a 5 to 10 point Republican advantage. Independents are probably going to lean towards Republicans, and that's showing up in the data. Yeah. Then, all things being equal, you got to drive up Democratic enthusiasm so that you can drive up Democratic turnout.
Yeah, in the last election, in 2018, last midterm election, O'Rourke, was a new charismatic candidate running against, Ted Cruz has an intense following, but Cruz was coming off a defeat in the Republican primary. Had some baggage.
Presidential primary.
In the presidential primary. The notion of Cruz invulnerability was kind of...
Yeah, his persona took a hit.
And by the way, just a quick note, I remember a story Ted Kennedy used to tell about his toughest re-election fight in Massachusetts, and they asked him about 1994, this big Republican wave year, and he cited 1982, the year after he'd lost the Democratic primary to Jimmy Carter, and his argument was that he took huge hits, and not just hits nationally, but hits that were felt in Massachusetts. And I kept thinking about that in 2018 when Cruz was running.
Right.
But that was a year in which Democratic enthusiasm, anti-Trump sentiment, anti-Cruz sentiment in Texas, new, hot candidate in Beto O'Rourke was off the charts. Yeah. And the question in that election was, could Cruz get Republicans to match that Democratic enthusiasm? Because there was I talked to several Republican consultants at the time, and they said the Democratic vote was there. They were going to show up, and the question was whether West Texas Republicans or moderate Republicans, were they enthused enough to kind of save Cruz? And turnout was over 8 million, and they did. But I don't feel that way in this election. In this election, it feels like enthusiasm is maybe even slightly favorable to the Republicans because of the national context. And, if Beto can get to parity, that's probably pretty good. But he needs a considerable amount more than parity to pull this off.
One big difference between this election and that one was, all our polling, and I think others too, in that election showed independents breaking decisively for O'Rourke. And it's a small slice of the electorate, but when you're talking about, tight margins, it's those small slices that add up. And that's clearly not the case in
That's
this
not what's
poll,
going
and it
on
hasn't
here.
been the case in these polls. I mean,
Right.
it's sort of, there's a glass half full, glass half empty thing for the Democrats here. And you can see some of this on the down ballot races too, I think. When we look at favorability ratings, we compare, O'Rourke's and Abbott's favorability numbers. So not job approvals, but just to put them on a similar scale. 41% of voters have a favorable view of O'Rourke, 48% have an unfavorable view. On Abbott, it's even, 45-45. It's not like he's, overwhelmingly popular here, or he's, even stands out. I mean, one of the things that I noticed recently, I have to go back and look for the August polling, but in the June polling, his job approval numbers in June of that year were more negative among Democrats than Cruz's were at the same time in the 2018 race. And the idea was that, Cruz is the boogeyman. Democrats, hate Ted Cruz, are going to turn out to vote him out. And really, negative attitudes towards Abbott are even higher. But I think the thing that strikes me and about this is that, but the issue environment just doesn't reinforce anything that would help the Democrats. I mean, if we're talking about immigration and border security, O'Rourke is in trouble.
Yeah, I think, and what the way you've expanded the conversation, Josh, is also illustrative. To Jim's point earlier, how does a Democrat win in Texas? Given the Republican advantage, you have to have an issue environment that's favorable, or you have to have a huge candidate advantage. And there's probably some other, a scandal or some sort of.
We can only speculate, right?
Right. Exactly.
We can only speculate.
That's since 1994.
It's a pretty abstract exercise, right?
And I'm with you. You're reading the tea leaves here, and just to put some numbers to Josh's earlier point. What is the most important problem facing Texas? Josh talked about numbers within subgroups, but just overall, 18% say rising prices. 12% say. Actually, that's the country. Wait. Let me go to Texas. Okay, border security, 16. Immigration, 14. So that's 30% saying immigration,
which is over half of Republicans.
Right. Inflation, rising prices, 10%. Right. So that's 40% saying immigration, border security, or inflation.
Which are the things that the Abbott campaign has been wanting to talk about since the moment they conceived of themselves as a campaign.
Right. Mm-hmm. By contrast, abortion, 8%. Gun control, gun violence, 7%. So it's 40 to 15. That's just not an issue environment that smells like an upset to me. And, your numbers on the favorability, the sort of personal ratings towards the candidates, also, O'Rourke is close to 50% unfavorable. He's taken I mentioned Cruz. I think O'Rourke took on,
I was
some
thinking
water.
That when you were saying that.
Yeah,
but in many ways,
2020.
after the 2020 election, now I think I don't think he has been hurt quite as much, but that is baked into the negatives. I mean, you were talking about Abbott being a known quantity. Attitudes towards O'Rourke are also pretty baked in.
It's the intersection of these two things, though, right?
Yeah.
I mean, ultimately, I think for independents in 2018, and this is just speculating this and to some extent, but they were also extremely negative towards Trump, who was kind of the main mobilizing factor of sort of anti-Republican vote sentiment in that election, right? And so that was sort of sitting out there, and and O'Rourke was able to do that without having developed all the negatives he's developed. Now when you think about sort of the intersection between sort of the attitudes of independents combined with the issues that they're talking about, because independent attitudes, we should just say, they're going to fluctuate, right? I mean, when we go and do fave-unfaves on these candidates from one poll to the next, there's going to be a lot more movement because they're not, number one, they're not paying as much attention in most cases than like really intense partisans, but also partisans are moored by their partisanship. So either they're looking at different news, they're processing information in ways that, again, reinforce their attitudes, whereas independents don't have any of that. So is the issue environment, let's say, let's just pretend for a second, we can play hypotheticals. Let's say that the election was entirely about gun laws in Texas. Well, if that was what the election were really about, then I would expect independents to be looking more favorably towards O'Rourke based on their underlying attitudes towards guns. But if it's about immigration, and you look at their underlying attitudes towards immigration, and I mean, one of the sort of attitudes we've been highlighting in this poll is the fact that a majority of Texas voters, including a large majority of Republicans and a majority of independents, expressed support for the busing policy. Right. And I think that's something that, again, if you're in Texas, that could either seem surprising or not surprising. If you're outside of Texas, I think it's probably pretty surprising based on the coverage you've seen. But ultimately, the thing about the policy is unless you're, you're paying so much attention that you're actually talking about an argument about the intention of the policy, which is really like people like, really focused politicos. A lot of people are just looking at this, and you could be someone who has a nativist attitude who approves of this policy. You could be someone who approves this policy on humanitarian grounds. But ultimately,
I'm pretty sure the Abbott people are quite happy that.
Oh yeah, no, I mean the Abbott. Yeah. I mean, look, it's hard to look at this data and not say that they're playing.
That's
a very good chess match here.
Yeah,
because there's not really anywhere for there's nowhere for him to go.
Thinking about what to give pride of place and rolling this out, and
Well, that's
it gives you so much leverage on the political environment right now. I think.
Real specifically. So Josh mentioned that there's good things for both sides. If I'm the O'Rourke people, I'm looking at the fact that you're within 5 or 6 points according to this poll. That Abbott is under 50%. Right. That's something that I'm sure they're happy about. That abortion and gun control are at least on the agenda. And that there is not overwhelming, support for the Dobbs decision and, Texas's trajectory, right? So maybe you've had a little bit of a, shaking up of an issue environment that was sort of universally bad. But if you're the Abbott people, you're up 5 points, you're winning with independents, your side is fired up, there's no Republican defection, the issue environment looks good, you're more favorable than your opponent. That's that's a pretty
I might not have any debates.
And the numbers that they're seeing on, not to beat a dead horse here, but the numbers that they're seeing on the busing policy is a real validation, not just of the policy, but of the campaign part of the selling of that policy. I mean, there is a real meeting of, we wrote in one of the rollout documents. I mean, the style and the substance with this policy are really converging in the sense that, Abbott's critics are saying, oh, this is just, to your point about, the intent of the policy or the effect. The intent and the effect of the policy for most people that embrace it is the trolling nature of it and the fact that, the way that Abbott is selling it. And that's that's an interesting adoption to my mind, by a guy like Governor Abbott of the more contemporary pugnacious style that, Trump didn't invent. I mean, it's fair to say, really in Texas, Cruz, Dan Patrick were there first. Abbott has not historically been quite that guy. With this policy, he is that guy.
But you said
I think.
I think that's exactly right. I think the broader thing I'd say is that sometimes people look at policies that are pursued in Texas, whether it's by Cruz or whether it's in this case by Abbott, and think, boy, that's too much. But within Texas, they get covered slightly differently. They're felt slightly differently, and they tend to be quite popular. This is the thing that Josh and I have talked about, and Jim, you probably were in these conversations too, where a lot of the sort of opprobrium tossed on Ted Cruz. I can't think of too many things Ted Cruz has done in terms of issue positioning that don't fit well with his constituents in Texas, and that's what Abbott has really done here. I mean, I don't know that there have been many missteps.
Well, I just want to. I mean, I want to add. Well, go ahead. I'll add something to what you said.
Well, I want to move on to something else. So quickly, yeah.
Okay, I mean, all I want to say is, you made the point that, for a lot of people who support the policy, sort of the fact that it's trolling is the value. But I would actually say, one, I think we can look in the data a little bit further to kind of figure that out a little bit. But I think the other piece of this is that, this is another example of where I think, national coverage almost universally, but a lot of Democrats in Texas in particular, really undervalue the issue of the border here. They tend to think of it all as symbolic, all as, this idea of trolling and all that kind of stuff. But the reality is, this is like a weird analogy, but I think it works. If you think about if you're a Democrat who lives in any urban area and think about the sort of uproar that occurs when some homeless people start to move on your corner. Well, imagine what happens if you're in a community and you've got, some number of undocumented immigrants, basically driving through in a high-speed chase once a week, once a month. It doesn't really matter. It's an issue.
Yeah.
It's a serious issue. And so really, yes, some people want to troll, but I think for, probably a not insignificant share of that support, there are people who just say, great. Ultimately, ultimately you want to move, but partially either whether you're spreading out, the problem, whether you're moving them on to their next destination, whatever. But I mean, there's a NIMBY aspect that you could imagine, to some aspect of this too, that I think is out there.
I don't disagree with this, but I would say that, per something, data you put together, the share of the electorate that's actually experiencing those problems you're talking about is pretty small.
Oh, sure.
Right. And I do, but I mean, I was pretty deliberate in saying it's not just the trolling, it's the fact that the trolling delivery and the integration of that trolling aspect of the policy does merge with the substance of a lot of anxieties, concerns, objections to immigration and border security. So I think it's the merging of the substance. It's not that it's just completely vacuous or that or not. But I think but what you're talking about does show up in our numbers in terms of, a non-trivial amount of Democrats, say, for example.
About 1 in 5
who are
supportive of the policy.
Who approve of the policy. And some of them are probably, as you were alluding to earlier, people that go, oh, how nice, we're giving these people rights.
Just a
but there's also people that are just do like it.
Just a real quick point, too. The Biden administration's reaction to the situation on the border, I think, is really interesting. One, it sort of proves this point that nobody's ever willing to admit they messed up anything at any time for any reason.
Yeah.
This is Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
That unwillingness, I think, hurts them in Texas and in Arizona and some other places where you're just sort of saying, this isn't an issue. What are you talking about? This is just partisanship. And now in Arizona, I think they care. I don't think they care that much in Texas. Now they may care because a key constituency seems to be, slipping through their fingers. But we'll see how that plays out. I've got a pet theory for another time about, for God's sakes, would one party or the other just come up and say, you know what, we didn't play this right, but we've learned from it and we're going to do,
Well, they do that sometimes. They usually just ignore it within 2 years.
That's what they do, yeah.
But there's also something, intrinsically difficult about that on the border because it's so complicated, right? And the things that you have to do are so structural. And it's most of the things most administrations on both sides have tried don't have much of an impact. I wanted to move on to the other races just a little bit. Mm-hmm. And, we were talking about the degree to which that, this kind of stylistic thing helps people. And Abbott is, and I mentioned, Dan Patrick and Ken Paxton have already been in that place for a while. I think it's fair to say, and that pugnaciousness was part of their brand pretty early on. Certainly Dan Patrick, Paxton maybe, even when he was in the Senate was, a pretty far to the right, but has obviously become much more combative to some degree, now that he's under siege. When I look at our poll numbers on these races, I always feel like it's really hard to get much out of them. I mean, you can get a little bit here and there. And I'm just wondering, there's been a lot of fizz in both of those races, among insiders. There was a kind of discarded rumor that was circulating a few days ago about the fact that, people were interpreting some actions attributed to the lieutenant governor as a sign that he thought he was in trouble. They pushed back on that. This is just at the rumor level. But just the fact that those things are being discussed, for a long time, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, wouldn't even mention Collier's name. And he did sort of call him out by name, I think, fairly recently. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what you make of that, what you guys make of that race. And even if you've heard anything, Daron, I don't know. But
no, nobody's focused on it. We as pollsters, we like to have it both ways, which is we understand that, the trial ballots are the dessert, the ice cream for the media and political practitioners and pundits. And so it's 40 minutes into the discussion. This is how we draw you in. And it's not that the numbers are, phonied up or, that we don't have confidence in them. It's just that we always take them with a large degree of, be careful here. And the be careful here.
Don't hurt yourself or us.
Right. That you're talking about between 1 out of 5 or probably closer to 1 out of 4 people don't have an opinion. They haven't thought about it. They don't know very much. We know about Paxton. We know about, Patrick and all of the issues associated with them. And so do a few people. But for the most part, when you're talking about an electorate where you're going to get 9 million or so Texans voting on this, if 1 million of them really have an opinion about Paxton or Patrick, I'd be surprised, right? So
that's interesting.
So what we're talking about here is essentially a party vote, as you see it right now, with a lot of people saying like, I don't really know what the party dynamic is here. I do think that the small thing that I would point out is both Patrick and Paxton, as you've alluded to, Jim, have taken on some damage over the course of their incumbencies, right? And so. The question for them, and this is what the Patrick campaign, I'm sure, is dealing with right now, is are people going to focus enough on this race so that I want to name my opponent and brand my opponent in a negative way? Or do I want to ignore him and simply kind of assume people are going to go down ballot and vote Republican, and I'm going to be okay? And this is a classic lower ballot. I know light gov and AG are not, they're consequential races, but they're still down ballot.
Yeah, we're all adults here.
Yeah, exactly. So what do? What's the smart play? Do you assume that Collier and Garza are going to spend sufficient money to develop a brand, and therefore you want to get in there and influence that branding? Or do you assume that so much oxygen is going to be consumed by the gubernatorial race and national politics that I'm just going to glide along? I don't want to bring any attention to them.
Yeah, and there's a lot of real inside baseball going on here. I mean, in the last week, we had kind of a flare-up in the Fort Worth, Tarrant County area where, a few prominent local elected officials, current and former, kind of made a point of going out and saying, hey, look, I'm not mentioning anybody by name, but I'm not voting for all the I'm not voting straight Republican ticket. And I think that did probably rattle some of the down ballot people, because I don't think they're talking about the governor.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the signal was they're not talking about the governor.
Yeah, I mean, I think, I agree with everything that Daron said. And I think, there's some stuff in the poll that really illustrates this dynamic explicitly and very, very particularly. So, I mean, the first thing I'll just point out, we've pointed this out a couple times, is, Patrick and Paxton, I mean, despite the fact that Paxton has all the legal baggage associated with him, they look pretty similar. I mean, just in terms of evaluations, job approvals. I mean, among Republicans, favorability ratings, 68% have a favorable view of Dan Patrick, 11% an unfavorable view. For Paxton, it's 66-12. I mean, that's the same thing as far as we're concerned as pollsters. What's interesting, what I did notice, and this is something that I think is one benefit of us doing more polling, we see these little changes, but I would also say this strikes me as different than prior elections I've seen, is the extent to which the Democratic candidates were able to increase their name ID and do so positively among their voters. And this is the thing, is that they've been mostly ignored by the Republican candidates, and the data also reflects that. So, for example, Mike Collier, in April polling, 25% of Democrats had a favorable view of him, 11% had an unfavorable view. In this poll, it was 48-7. Among Hispanics, he went from 11-11 favorable, unfavorable to 28-9. Rochelle Garza, the Democratic AG candidate, a little bit even more impressive in some ways. She went from 20 fav, 8 unfav among Democrats to 52-2. Among Hispanics, she went from 8-9 to 32-13. And this was not matched in any way by a comparable or even small increase in negative ratings among Republicans, because ultimately they're being ignored, right? I mean, this is the election point here. So on the one hand, I think, and I say glass half full, glass half empty, for down ballot Democratic candidates, this kind of increase in name ID, even among Democrats, I think is impressive. I mean, just having gone back and done these elections, I mean, you could run the entire campaign and we could still be at the end and not have half of Democrats with a view of who the Democratic AG candidate is. Like, that's a possibility. So on the one hand, there's that. On the other hand, when you look at the top of the ticket and you'd say, well, O'Rourke's at +5 and Paxton's at +5 and,
Abbott's at +5.
Abbott's at +5 and Paxton's at +5 and Patrick's at +7. I mean, if I'm sitting there thinking, like, well, if Abbott thinks he's going to win, to Daron's point, I'm probably going to win too. And there's not a lot in these numbers that makes you think there's any reason not to believe that to be the case, even though I think, the Democrats in these races are actually doing a relatively remarkable job getting their name out there in such a big state. But it's probably not enough.
Right, and I want to be, I'll be a little touchy-feely about this. I think you can't underestimate, in terms of the internal dynamics in these campaigns right now, the experience that Paxton, Patrick had in 2018, where they won by much narrower margins than they expected. I mean, was it a little less than 5 in the Collier Patrick race? And as you were talking about 2018, Daron, I was remembering the story that I heard shortly, like right around that time, as it was, shortly after it happened, and then showed up in some news coverage. So feel free to talk about it. But that, when the early voting numbers came in, there was kind of an emergency call at the top of the ticket, and I won't ask you if you were on it, but in which everybody said, "Hey, we know you have money left. Democratic turnout is very high. Go out and spend your damn money, on Election Day turnout for Republicans." It's probably a little extreme to say that saved Cruz, but I bet it helped a lot. And so I think that dynamic is going on out there, and it's coloring this a little bit. And I think it does make people a little touchy.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, that's right. I remember talking to some Republicans. I probably told this story, so I apologize if people have heard it before. But they were saying that once turnout creeped above 8 million in 2018, they felt good. They felt good. If it was 775, 780, 7.8, 7.9 million, they were concerned because they thought the variable in that election was Republican turnout. And to your point, Jim, Republican election day turnout. I don't know if the same dynamic exists here. I mean, I do think there's a little bit of
I think the
election
context
day.
is different this time.
Yeah, but the question about, are we going to get our people out? Are they going to get their people out? Is still the question. And I think right now we'll probably talk about this, a little bit. Attitudinally, Republicans do look a little more fired up about it. If we were to, at this point, and we don't run a likely voter screen right now, we don't, because our belief is that, it's largely based on attitudes, and attitudes in late August are not kind of sufficiently predictive.
Yeah, traditionally what we've done is we've switched to a likely voter screen in October because then we're getting up to where people are actually thinking about voting.
Right, because what will happen is, there's usually a skew to who's interested and who's engaged, and the other side comes to be more concerned, more interested, more involved late. And if you're running a likely voter screen in May or June, it looks like, wow, look at all this movement, when in fact it's just one side coming to the party a little late. And so we just don't think those screens are very predictive.
A conversation for another day, but I mean, I don't know about you, but so how certain are you about what turnout's going to be?
Yeah, I'm not.
Exactly.
Yeah, exactly. So, but all those caveats and hopefully,
and reasonable people can disagree about this.
No,
I mean,
exactly,
it's not,
exactly. But I would say that if you look at
Josh is shaking his nothing.
Yeah. But if you look at
unreasonable people can disagree.
Right. If you look at some of our measures up front about how fired up you are, how likely you are to vote, and if you look at the ballots amongst those voters, the Republican advantage increases. And people are free to take a look at that, in the survey.
And this is the whole thing, though. But I mean, I think this reflects what we know, which is that Republicans have a reliable majority in the voting electorate because they have for the last 20 years. And so, we're looking because we're interested in this to see, are there indications of the change? Are there indications that the environment has shifted in such a way so that we would suspect that this might be different? And ultimately, what we're tending to find here is, a reinforcement, data that reinforces the patterns that we've witnessed, but those patterns also include an increasingly competitive, though not overly competitive environment, right? Yeah. And that's what we're seeing here, So it's a closer race. It's more interesting, unless something changes dramatically in terms of the issue set, I think, before Election Day.
Or as you said, and this is for you, Ross Ramsey, or an exogenous shock.
Yeah, well, that's what I mean. That's what I would almost expect to have happen. I mean, that's almost what would have to happen.
That was Ross's nickname in high school.
Ooh, I hope he's listening.
Actually, that'd be a great nickname.
As long as we're ranging, I don't think I've told you this, Daron. I think Josh knows this, but when U of H released their poll report for one of their recent reports, they used the term exogenous shock in the report, and I sent it to Ross, and I sent it to Ross in an email. It was shortly after Ross had retired, going, "See, it's not just us." And his only response was, "What's wrong with you people?"
Well, that's a broader, relevant question.
That's talking about a different podcast.
Right.
No, I think that's right. So to wind it up, guys, but let's I'm pretty satisfied with the degree to which we've kind of really unpacked the environment a bit here. But I want to do what we always do, which is, ask you guys, something interesting that stuck out to you that we might not have touched on yet. Or if we did and you want to expound a little more, I've got to expound on the mind because somebody used it on me on Twitter today. How about it?
I'll go first. The right direction, wrong track question, which is a staple of polling and has been since, I want to say Bob Teeter came up with this question back in the late 60s and early 70s. If you look at the disjuncture between the national and the state numbers, it's another reason. I'm not sure if I were a Republican, I'd be thrilled with this in Texas, but it's notable. 69% of people say that the country is moving in the wrong direction. 52% say the state of Texas is moving in the wrong direction. And you might look at that and say, well, 50, that's a majority who think Texas is moving in the wrong direction. Well, there's kind of a traditional bias in response to that question. The negative response, even when things are just flying, everybody, there's a tendency for people to say, well, I still think we're moving in the wrong direction because it invokes some sort of morality kind of evaluation or something. But that's a 17-point difference. So you've got this, and I think it's relevant to the conversation we're having, which is, people think the country's got some real problems, and they're not happy with sort of the performance of either party. In Texas, it's ambivalent. It's not quite as positive and rosy as it was maybe 10 years ago, but there's still a notable disjuncture, and I think that's probably good for incumbents right now.
Yeah, I'm not a devil's advocate, but that number, I suspect Josh is going to wait in now. I've jumped, but that number is high. I mean, it's only that it's only what, the fourth time it's been over 50% in the history of the poll,
and three polls in a row this year.
Right. So there's
something there, even if.
But I think your point stands
though,
Darren, that there's still the presence of the contrast in the national environment is pretty.
Are you saying it could be so much worse?
Something like.
Well, as
this.
I said, there's something for everybody in the polling numbers, and there is there as well.
How about you, Josh?
Oh, there's a lot of things, we could talk about, but I guess,
pick one.
I'm going to pick one. I'll try.
Lightning round.
I think, looking ahead, I guess. I'll look ahead. I mean, there's two directions I could have gone. I could look back or look ahead. I'll look ahead. One of the things we asked about was, future abortion laws here in Texas. Ultimately, we're going to have this election. Most likely Republicans are going to be, holding all the top statewide offices. More certain than that, they will have a majority of seats in the legislature, both the House and the Senate. And so the question becomes, we have one of the most restrictive abortion laws in the country. Now what? And we asked basically, would you approve or disapprove of Texas, enacting policies? And we said design two. And we have
this is a good way to sneak a bunch of different things as one.
And so, so we have expand legal access, which got a majority support, 50%, 31% were opposed. This would be thinking about like cases of rape, incest, things like that. But all of the other sort of, further enforcement mechanisms, had majority opposition. So, just basically increasing resources to the state's enforcement was opposed by 51%, only supported by 26%. Trying to prevent the travel of, women to get abortions in states where it's legal was opposed by 60% of voters, only supported by 18%. Trying to further prevent, the shipping of abortion pills through the mail, 54% opposition. Penalizing companies that pay for travel, 52% opposition, 29% support. I imagine as we talk about these issues more, the support is going to tick up among Republicans once there's if there's a focus on one or the other. But as of right now, I mean, this is something that we've been talking about, and I don't know, this is probably not going to play out in this election is what it looks like. But this is kind of the next kind of big thing around this space is going to be, okay, we've banned it, but what does that really mean now? Yeah,
and I think to pick up on that from the, and I'm glad you kind of brought something that brings the legislature into it. What's going to be interesting is going to be what I would anticipate being a contrast between how this configuration of public opinion is viewed differently by the leadership in the Senate and the leadership in the House.
I'll tell you what though. No one wants to talk about any of this stuff right now.
Well, I don't know.
I mean,
no, not right now.
No, not right now.
Not right now. But I think the lieutenant governor may well want to talk about it some more come January.
Oh yeah.
If he wins, which again,
what about
more
you?
Likely than not.
What about you?
Well, I'm going to do something that I think is both backwards and forwards, right? Because that's how I am.
That's on brand.
Yes, and that is, we did a battery of questions. We asked people about, whether they thought, 3 different things should be legal in Texas, and we asked about.
So a battery is multiple questions?
Yeah, 3. Well, yes, exactly. But I'm only going to focus on one.
Oh, okay.
I'm going to mention what the 3 are just to provide context. Same-sex marriage, interracial marriage, and access to contraception. The outlier in that group was same-sex marriage. And several years now after the Supreme Court struck down state bans on gay marriage, those numbers had not moved very much. And I think that's why I'm saying it's both backwards and forwards. On one hand, I think I have friends that are, probably, either on the progressive or libertarian side of things that kind of felt like this was settled.
Yeah.
Right. And as we've been looking at this kind of revanchist sort of cultural politics arising again in the country, but particularly in Texas, it's very interesting to see that this is not settled among Republicans in particular.
Yeah.
Right. A lot, this is something that, and this came up in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision and some of the underlying logic related to Griswold. And so I think this is a very interesting
and it's also
result in terms of moving forward and, what we see opened up in the state.
It has a little bit of a right now piece to it too, because I mean, to the extent that the House passed a bill codifying same-sex marriage, a couple of Texas Republicans actually voted for it, which has been problematic.
Right, which they've heard about.
And some of the Democrats who voted for it in some of the border areas have heard about it.
Those Republicans probably wish that we had done this polling. We'd asked this question a little sooner.
Maybe so. So this is. So I mean, it's interesting that to the extent that the House took this up, the idea was to the extent that people thought maybe this is uncontroversial. Well, the aftermath has shown that it was not uncontroversial, and the polling reinforces why.
Yeah. So I thought that was really interesting, and it's one of those things where you go, well, I'm not surprised in retrospect, but when I first saw it, I was a little surprised. Yeah. So, guys, thanks a lot. This has been more fun than people should have at work.
Thank you, appreciate it.
So thanks, Daron Shaw. Thanks, Josh Blank. Thanks to all of you for listening. As always, particularly since we've run long today, thanks a lot to our excellent production team in the audio studio and the Liberal Arts Development Studio at UT Austin. Again, thanks to you for listening. Remember, new polling data out today. You can find it all at texaspolitics.utexas.edu. If you go to the website, click on the polling tag, go to the blog, and you'll find it. But really, we do a pretty good job on Google. If you can also just hit the latest poll link, and you'll find the product, again, of a ton of work by Josh, and that there are several hundred free downloadable graphics in multiple formats that you can use for teaching.
I'm sorry.
He always wants me to, it's thousands, right?
There are several hundred sets of graphics, and there are about...
No, I meant for one poll.
Yeah, for one poll, there are several hundred sets of graphics. Okay. There are actually 1,000 or more individual graphics. I don't know why
you ever do a shout out for him. He can't just take it. He can't just take it and drop the mic.
Hey, thanks, man. Yeah, it's great. Anyway, thanks to Josh for all the work. Go find the zillions of graphics that
Thank you.
Josh built by hand.
Yep. Through them.
Working 24 hours a day for all of us, for the good of the people of Texas and America.
I don't even build a state for it.
While fighting crime.
While fighting crime. So thank you very much for listening. We'll be back next week with another Second Reading podcast. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.